Oh, and it's a good question because I hadn't really thought before this year that I was going to run for office. My involvement in politics has always been behind the scenes. I worked as a staffer at the state house. I worked as a staffer for the mayor, doing that sort of behind the scenes work. And then when I went to go to grad school and work in academia, I kind of my thought was that I would be more involved in advocacy, like doing something like you guys are doing, for an organization that I was passionate about, probably something like Transit Matters, and just kind of be on that side of things. But two things really kind of pulled me, back in. One was being involved in the mayor's reelection campaign in Revere last year, and that really kind of stoked the competitive fires. I think if you're someone like us, you get involved in an election, you feed off that, and you want to be as involved as you can be. But then also just the seat opened up, and I was kind of looking at, and this is pre-COVID, but I was looking at, the Massachusetts legislature is staring down all these huge crises, transportation crisis, climate crisis, housing crisis, and really just not acting quickly enough or at all in some cases in some of these urgent priorities, which are so important to my generation. And I felt that we were only going to have one candidate, it looked like, for the race, who is a person who I like, but just is not someone who's ever struck me as sort of outspoken on these important issues or priorities. And so I felt like in such an important election year, we really needed to have a real conversation about these things. And so my goal was get in, run on policy, talk about the things that matter to me. And I happen to think that I have a resume that would make me a pretty good fit for the seat. I worked at the State House. I worked on the mechanics and nuts and bolts of bills. I built coalitions to get a pretty good environmental bill passed. I worked in a city, so I know the nuts and bolts of local government, and I'm in touch with the residents of my community, and was involved in trying to make some positive change there in my city. And I've been really active in the community. So I think I have a resume that really fits this seat. I have a real deep passion about these issues. And I really want to fight for the kind of change that we need to see in the legislature. And I just didn't think that we were getting it, from what we had as options. So here I am. um, so there's not enough urgency for a lot of reasons, to deal with some of these issues. Part of it is because I think there's just not enough legislators who really care about them. I don't know if they just think it doesn't affect their generation, or they think that the voters that they listen to don't care about things like the climate crisis or the transportation crisis. So that's part of it. I think certainly the fact that we kind of have an uncompetitive, there's so many uncontested elections, and so you have a lot of complacency. Um, and then it is so top heavy, power is so centralized in a few hands in the House. We've at least seen in the Senate where they've had some rule changes that you've seen some more ambitious ideas at least come to the surface, and you've seen legislators have to go on record sort of one way or the other on how they feel about these things. In the House that very rarely happens, although we've had a pretty big spate of roll call votes lately, which is exciting if you're a political geek, but very rare. So I think there's just not enough of that. So the sort of lack of ambition to meet the moment, I don't know if it's out of political calculation or out of complacency or just out of the way that the House is structured and how it works and what the values and priorities are of the people that have the power and influence. But those are the things that are wrong with it, and like I think there's a lot of good people there. Like I worked there, and I think that a lot of people rightly were like, well, this is the system that exists, and like you have to kind of play along in this system and do it this way to try to get your priority thing done and get money for your district. And I empathize with that. Uh, it wasn't something long-term viable for me to, kind of stay around in that structure. But I empathize with people that try because I understand the importance of kind of trying to push things in the right direction. But I think that ultimately, in order to change that culture, we just need new representatives with new ideas and new perspectives. Well, first of all, first and foremost, I'm hopeful that we end up getting at least 16 people elected, that have signed on to the pledge. I think we're at 12, and then we've got a good number of candidates running that I think are awesome candidates that have a great chance. And so that's step one. You get that 16, you can start forcing roll call votes and make people at least have to own their vote. which hopefully will either get people to come off the fence on things that they say they support or make them go back on their word. And then it sends a message to their constituents that maybe you might want to vote for someone else. So step one is hopefully being part of that 16. I think step two is also using my platform to try to go straight to my public and my voters and in my district and tell them, like, here are the changes that we're trying to make. Like, I had a vote committee today. I'm on whatever committee. This is what I voted on. Unless I told you that proactively, you wouldn't know, because you don't have to know. And hopefully by making the case directly to the public about the changes that we're trying to make, it increases awareness and hopefully starts a trend of things like that happening. Thing about working at the State House is that I can't necessarily say that I had to take a lot of actions that went contrary to my values, because you don't really get to do anything if you're a staffer of a, someone who's not like in high level leadership. Like, I certainly like would have to, when constituent emails would come in, I'd have to respond and like for the rep that this is why they voted the way they did, or whatever. And I didn't always agree with it. Like, for instance, I was working in the legislature when like the Snowmageddon incident happened in 2015, which was really formative for me when I think about like when I was like, all right, like we need some serious changes. Like, was it 15 or 16? It was 15, because it was right when Big came into office. And, all the emails that would come in from people that ride the commuter rail, because we had a mostly commuter rail district. I worked for the rep from Lynn, Swampscott, Marblehead. And, had the boilerplate, like, I care a lot about public transportation and blah, blah, blah. But like, we weren't really doing anything about public transportation. So yeah, I mean, that was probably the closest I've ever come to having to like take an action that wasn't aligned with what I felt. But there weren't really a lot of like actions. I know that anyone can say this, but really, I think I've demonstrated kind of like the campaign that I worked on for our current mayor to go against the former mayor and sort of the entrenched political machine in Revere. I don't care like that people are going to come at me, and say that we're shaking things up and doing the wrong thing. I've always been of the belief that, I'm in this to try to do what I think is right and do what I think is best. So like being thrown in the basement's not going to bother me. Like putting my desk in the hallway like Ed Markey's not going to bother me.